I'm going to give a chronology, a sort of rough chronology of what happened with the coronavirus here in South Korea, and then offer some thoughts on what I think other countries can learn from it. Now, the virus started manifesting itself, obviously, in Hubei province in China, and there were news stories about that through December, and it started to spread. And there were cases that started to emerge in South Korea, and it started to sort of really register on people's radar around mid-January. Now, my wife came over. I was in Canada at the time, and my wife came over a bit later, and she came over on January the 31st. And by that point, the number of cases in South Korea was starting to grow. Most of them were still localized in Seoul and Incheon and so forth. And they were not associated with ethnic Chinese, even though Koreans were very nervous about ethnic Chinese, but they were the result of a lot of travel back and forth between Korea and China. There's huge economic integration between South Korea, China, and Japan, despite the bickering that goes on at a governmental level between those different nations. Now, what happened was suddenly in February there was an explosion of cases, but they were not in the Seoul area. Seoul is a massive megacity that just spreads out and has a population of 25 million, and it's in a province, a very compact province called Gyeonggi-do, which has another few million. So most of the Korean population is located here in Seoul and in Gyeonggi-do. However, the really big outbreak was in a city called Daegu, which is 300 kilometers south of Seoul. And it wasn't because of economic interchange, it was because of sort of religious and cultural factors. Now, there's a group down there, a millenarian sect that believes in the end of the world when something like 144,000 people honestly believe in Jesus Christ and also believe in the leader of the church who presents himself as a kind of Messiah. In other words, a church that's really a kind of cult. That church is called Shincheonji, and Shincheonji does a lot of missionary work and a lot of proselytizing. It's always trying to win converts. And it had people over in Hubei province who were proselytizing to Chinese citizens. And there was one woman in the congregation, in one of the congregations in Daegu, who became infected. She's patient X. She was 61 years old. Now, I'm not sure if she was in China herself or came in contact with somebody who'd been traveling back and forth between China and South Korea, but she became infected with coronavirus. However, because of her own superstition and her own paranoia and her own lack of logic, even when she started showing symptoms of the disease, she kept going to Sunday church services, and she infected several other people. She seems to have believed that going to church was a more logical way to deal with the illness than going to a doctor. Now, paranoia and lack of logic are unfortunately hallmarks of this particular sect. And when the explosion in new cases happened, other church members were not forthcoming to the authorities. The church itself was very intransigent and did not cooperate with the medical authorities or the police. It seems to have provided a membership list to them, which was necessary in order for all the church members to be tested. That was not complete, and there was a lot of complication that resulted from that, because then the authorities had to go back and retrieve an even fuller list. They had to get injunctions and so forth. It was a mess. Now, because of those infections, that original cluster of infections, they spread out from the congregation, and they are now at the point where they have infected another hospital that is not in Daegu but fairly close, in Gyeongsang-bukdo, and they have infected regular citizens, non-Shincheonji members in Daegu. So the infection has really spread in that area. There are more than 7,000 infections in Korea uh, that have been diagnosed and tested for. There have been around 50, close to 50 deaths. Most of those deaths are among older people with repressed immune systems, depressed immune systems rather, and they that is not a high figure, really. That's not a high death rate. In other words, the Korean medical system, when it diagnoses people, has done a pretty good job of helping people recover and keeping them from succumbing to the disease. But for the most part, there has been this problem that's localized in Daegu. However, new clusters are starting to emerge. For example, there's a hospital in Bundang, which is a satellite city, which is south of Seoul, and it has also had a cluster of infections. So, and in Seoul itself, there will be maybe 1 or 2 new infections every day, but the rate of infection has grown very slowly. People in South Korea are hopeful that the infection rate will not suddenly explode in Seoul. There was panic buying here in Seoul, obviously of masks. There was a complete lack of masks in corner stores and in pharmacies for a few weeks, actually. If you hadn't bought a mask already, you were out of luck. And in particular, these N95 masks that people talk about, those were very hard to get. Now, the government is providing masks on a ration system by this point. You have to go to a pharmacy. This just started yesterday, by the way. You have to go to a pharmacy. You have to show your ID, and then you get 2 masks. Now, so the masks are starting to be distributed again to the population. But there was panic buying of food, there was panic buying of toilet paper, the same things that we see in Canada and the United States, the same behavior patterns of people panicking. In Korean stores, for a few days, the shelves were empty of certain items. However, the shelves have filled back up again, so there has not been a breakdown in civilization. If you're a prepper, sorry, you're out of luck. You're jumping the gun. So mass panic, mass buying of foodstuffs and so forth, hoarding of masks in sort of a greedy way, those are all things to avoid. They're not necessary. But using a mask, even though North Americans, Canadians, and Americans and so forth are being told that masks are not necessary unless you are sick, in which case you should wear a mask, or unless you're a medical professional, in which case you should wear a mask. Kind of a mixed message there. Despite the fact that people in Canada and the United States are being told that masks are not necessary, I would recommend using a mask anyway if you can get one. Get in the habit, because it prevents you from touching your nose and your mouth. It's very effective that way. So it's basically a good idea. And of course, wash your hands very frequently. Get hand sanitizer if you can, but even regular soap will do the job as long as you wash your hands for 20 seconds and dry them thoroughly. And then finally, avoid public spaces. This panic, the secondary panic that's happening about the economy, well, that is serious, and the brunt of that pain is being borne, unfortunately, by small business people who are really seeing some of their businesses suffer. And of course, the stock market has dipped down on the assumption that there would be a break in supply chains. But the Chinese have got their factories up and running. They're creating as much pollution as they ever did, subject for a different post. And so there's not going to be a big economic calamity as a direct result of all this. But there are a lot of small businesses that are hurting. Nevertheless, people should protect themselves. They should avoid theaters. They should avoid uh, uh, public meetings. They should avoid religious meetings, for that matter. Stay at home, and if you go out to open spaces. There are a lot of people right now who are hiking and biking in Seoul, and that is the right thing to do. Get outside of the house and try to avoid enclosed spaces. If you have to take public transit, again, wear a mask. And Be sure to wash your hands after you emerge from a subway or bus.